good for everyone else. It's a bit dark. Just to say, we'll be starting in a couple minutes, so feel free to chat. We'll start very soon, though. Nice and spooky.
Yeah, we're just waiting for the spiders to come.
Yeah. How's the Zuni apple? Is it working? Yeah. Lovely. Okay. I will go. Yeah, I'm going to give it 2 more minutes for people to come in, so I'll go get the door done and closed.
Do that. I'll put it there so I don't have to carry it, otherwise I'll forget. Take it away.
Jakob? Fantastic. I'll use this one.
Yeah. You're going to swipe it up, apparently.
Hello?
Hello? Hello everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to a University of York Drug Science Society event. My name is Ben Claydon and I'm the president of the society. And I'm very, very happy to announce a man who needs no introduction, Professor David Nutt.
Well, thanks, Ben, and thanks to the rest of the team here at York. It's nice to be back. It's almost an annual event now, my talking at York. But this talk is somewhat different to the others I've given, because I'm trying to give it something of a Halloween theme, and I've darkened it not particularly to scare people, but actually so that some of the images I think you'll just find much more interesting in the dark than the light, because the talk really is much more about celebrating some of the wonders that we can get in terms of understanding the mind and consciousness from drugs, rather than scaring you in the dark. But enough of my picture, which is probably the scariest thing you're going to see today. Just to remind you all what drug science is, it's a charity that I set up when I was sacked by the government 14 years ago now, and we've been working hard over that period to keep on holding the government to account, trying to give them evidence on which to build sensible policies. That didn't work, but at least they can't sack me again. We've certainly transformed a lot of the narrative about drugs and drug harm and drug policy, and we've become really what our ambition was to be the charity that told the truth about drugs. And it's certainly almost a day doesn't go by without a journalist contacting me and asking me about the harms of drugs. So we've made real inroads into the public education about drugs and drug harm. So it's a charity. It's supported by various income streams, but perhaps the most important are the community members. Are there community members here today? Okay, well that's opportunity for you all to join. So that the image you'll be able to, that QR code you'll be able to see at the end if you're interested. So all talks have to start with a health advisory. This is me. This is a picture of me looking grim, standing outside my building in Imperial, quite a few years ago now, and that's a statue or a model of the dopamine system in the brain. And this is an article written about me by the magazine Science, and they called it the dangerous professor. And I said, surely there should be a question mark afterwards. And they said, no, you wouldn't have been sacked if you weren't dangerous. But in fact, the truth about this talk is not about my being dangerous. But this talk is very dangerous because it puts images of politicians. So you have been warned, and feel free to cover your eyes. This is my sacking. This is a rather generous caricature of me on the week. And for those of you who weren't around at the time, I suppose most of you were around, but some of you won't remember, I was sacked basically for arguing the drug policy wasn't evidence-based. You can see the book of Cannabis falling from my hand. And I was saying that these drugs here, alcohol and tobacco, were actually more problematic in British society than these drugs, these new chemicals such as cathinones and MDMA, etc. And the cartoonist has done a rather good job because the scales of justice are definitely tipped in favour of these legal drugs. So I was sacked. They tried to gag me, and I haven't been gagged. And this is one of the many examples of the talks I give to interested, educated, open-minded audiences about drugs and drug harm. But what's been clear over the last 30 years, I started working with the government in about 1992 when the first of the ecstasy deaths were coming out, and we started looking at how we could reduce the harms of ecstasy and reduce deaths, and we were rather successful in bringing in policies like water in clubs and chill-out rooms. But over the 30 years I've been in this field, it's been completely obvious to everyone that governments actively choose to ignore evidence. And in doing that, they almost always create greater harms. And I'm going to use nitrous oxide as the working example because next Wednesday, it will be illegal under the Misuse of Drugs Act to possess nitrous oxide for what is very interestingly called in the new statute, wrongful use. And that's going to be an interesting court case when we try to argue that there's no such thing as wrongful use. But anyway, that's going to be an offence punishable for up to 2 years in prison, the wrongful use of nitrous oxide. And I want to talk you through it because it's a really, as I said, it's a modern example of how politicians develop policies to serve their own goals, to placate the media, and almost always make things worse. Now, I'm particularly exercised by nitrous oxide because this is a great British drug. It was discovered by Priestley. It was popularised by this man. And Humphrey Davy was the president of the Royal Society. Some would say he's our greatest ever scientist. He discovered more elements than anyone else ever. And whilst he was doing his chemistry, he got interested and he got exposed to nitrous oxide. And afterwards, he reported about it, and he was very, very taken by the experience. He reported it having a euphoric effect. It relieved the pain of toothache, which was the first indication it might have the use which it has had now for several hundred years as an analgesic. And he coined the term laughing gas. But more than that, he realised that nitrous oxide was a way of understanding his mind and consciousness in a way that he couldn't or hadn't been able to up to now. And he said this: during the experience, he lost touch with all external things, entering a world of pure thought, which he described as a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. And he was so entranced by the idea of a drug changing the way he thought that he created a new society, a branch of the Royal Society called the Society for Chemical Philosophy. And that's remarkable. So you've got the leading scientists in Britain encouraging the use of this drug to help him and others understand the relationship between thought and science, chemistry and thought. Wow, how things have gone downhill over the last 200 years. So then, nitrous oxide was widely used. There were laughing gas parties. People had not just insight, but they also had fun. Dr. and Mrs. Syntax, there you go, making the nitrous oxide and people having these transient episodes of jollity and euphoria. Then, as now, it's a fun thing to do. It's pretty harmless, and it doesn't last very long. So 200 years on, we have the Psychoactive Substances Act, brought in 2018, purportedly to deal with the problems of synthetic cannabinoids and cathinones. It turned out to be very hard for the police to prosecute people with those, so they then turned to nitrous oxide for reasons I'll explain in a second. But this is the most prohibitive law in the world in relation to drugs, because it bans the sale of any psychoactive substances, whether they exist today or whether they will ever be made in the future. It doesn't actually name a substance. There's not a drug named in the Act, which is why it's been very hard for them to pursue it or to prosecute people under it, because there are court cases which have floundered on what a psychoactive substance is. And you can read critiques of this on our website. But the Psychoactive Substances Act was designed to stop head shops selling drugs. It wasn't designed to stop people using drugs. But of course, like most laws, there's a tendency for them to morph. There's creep. And nitrous oxide, as I said, will be banned from next week. And I want to talk you through the process of getting it banned, because I've watched this, I fought it, and I failed to stop it. But it's symptomatic of the way in which things happen. So the beginning of the attack on nitrous oxide came from the Sun newspaper. And the Sun was exercised by the fact that footballers were inhaling nitrous oxide balloons. And in a way, the ban of nitrous oxide started with the mobile phone, because without mobile phones, there wouldn't have been pictures of the footballers using the gas, and so the Sun wouldn't have got its knickers in a twist about it. And it was fun for them to portray footballers as doing something wrong, even though they weren't. It was perfectly legal what they were doing. Now, dumb as the Sun journalists are, they knew creating hysteria about laughing gas would not really cut it with the general public, certainly not with grannies and mothers who have it from childbirth. So they invented a new term, hippie crack, to scare people, to create moral panic about nitrous oxide. And of course that's ridiculous. The idea that nitrous oxide could be remotely like crack cocaine is completely laughable to anyone who's used it or seen people using it. But it was something newspapers could invent any term they like. We fought this, we argued against it, and we've actually managed to stop them using that term. But by that time, concerns had been raised. Despite the fact, over 200 years of widespread use, there have been no deaths. Some of our greatest poets, Coleridge and Southey, used it for poetic inspiration, and Southey came up with this remarkable description of nitrous oxide as being the atmosphere of heaven. And millions of women have used it for childbirth. Even Prince Harry used it, and the Sun didn't get particularly concerned about him using it. But bringing down soccer players is something that newspaper and to some extent other newspapers want to do. They're an easy target, they're rich, and they're young and fallible. I just want to make an observation, which I've made continuously, about the absurdity of banning nitrous oxide when you allow alcohol. So there are probably less than 2 deaths a year for nitrous oxide, and they tend to occur by people swallowing the balloon rather than from the gas itself. Alcohol is directly responsible for over 5,000 deaths, and it's another 20-odd thousand deaths are associated with the use of alcohol, like road traffic accidents. The other harms of nitrous oxide are very low, which is why it's a medicine. Alcohol could never be a medicine. And it's very short-acting, and footballers were rather smart. They realised that you could go to a party, have a bit of fun over a few minutes, an hour or so, with a few balloons of nitrous oxide, and you'd be perfectly able to play at your best the next day. Whereas if you drank alcohol, the hangover would impair your performance the next day. And we all know there are many examples of talented footballers whose lives and careers have been cut short by alcohol. So why did they want to ban it? Well, they wanted to ban it because they could. It was always a challenge, and I don't know if they even ever thought it through, but it was a simple, easy way to attack footballers. So here are two examples of the use of nitrous oxide in footballers. On the left is the very famous picture of Raheem Sterling inhaling a balloon. And he was vilified for that particular image. On the right is Luke Shaw. Luke Shaw is being carried off the pitch in Basel after he's broken his leg in a couple of places. And when he's being carried off, they're saying, oh, look, they've given him oxygen. Well, he doesn't need oxygen because Basel's pretty much at sea level. He's been given nitrous oxide because it's dealing with the pain of his fractured leg. And you know, it sort of highlights the ambiguity in this whole area, where that using something recreationally is seen as very bad. They won't even admit to the fact that if you're using it for pain, it could be good. It's just the part of this continual process of always trying to portray all drugs in the worst light possible. So how did the Psychoactive Substances Act come about? Well, it came about as a result of activity by this lady. There she was, the young version of her. Do you remember her with her leopard skin mules at the Conservative Party conference in 2003? You might say, why the hell would anyone remember this? I remembered it. Because she said then, and they were in opposition at the time, we must escape the image of being the nasty party. And I thought that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Why doesn't she say we've got to stop being the nasty party? Because they don't want to stop being the nasty party. No, and of course, getting into power, they were then able to continue being what they have been in terms of drug policy, a very nasty party. And this is her now. This is basically Theresa May. I'll stop you having fun, even if it's harmless. And she was the force behind bringing in the Psychoactive Substances Act. Because she, I believe, has a moral opposition to the use of any drug, with one exception, which of course is alcohol. And as some of you will probably know, she was the daughter of a vicar, and alcohol figures in religious ceremonies. It also figures in the life of many people. And I think she believed this commandment, thou shalt have no other drug but me, forever and ever, amen. And I can't prove it, but I'm almost certain the drinks industry was behind the attack on nitrous oxide, because young people were turning away from booze to use balloons. And that was, I'm sure, part of the concern that drove the Sun. And as you know, many journalists are rather entranced by alcohol, and they were probably being supported in their campaign by the alcohol industry. I can't prove it, but I'd be interesting if they were to deny it. But we shouldn't be sexist about this. Other male Tories also had different attitudes to drugs. So this is before he was Prime Minister. There's David Cameron. This is the Bullingdon Club. The Bullingdon Club was a drinking club. They drank so much that they had to take other drugs, and so that they didn't fall asleep as a result of all the alcohol. And this is what he didn't actually say this, but this is what I imagine he would be thinking when, having stepped down as Prime Minister, the nitrous oxide concerns rose, and his successors. So he's saying the proles are complaining we'll ban nitrous oxide. And the most recent ex-male Prime Minister, there's Boris. Let them snort coke. It was good enough for us. And I have to say, it's fascinating, isn't it? We've got massive evidence of cocaine use in the Houses of Parliament, but still 80% of the votes for the banning of nitrous oxide of the Misuse of Drugs Act, 80% of MPs who voted for the ban. But what's worse is that the attempt to control nitrous oxide, which, as I say, was largely driven by the media and the politicians succumbing to media pressure, was completely unnecessary. In fact, it led to much greater harms than if no one had done anything whatsoever. Because under the Psychoactive Substances Act, the selling of nitrous oxide was illegal, but the personal use was legal. So, and that was actually in the one saving grace of the Psychoactive Substances Act. It didn't criminalise people for using it. The first time we'd ever had a drug act which allowed people to possess drugs for personal use in small amounts. But the problem was the nitrous oxide was presented in the beginning, was being used in these small little metal canisters. You've all seen them around in car parks on the streets, called whippets. And as I said at the beginning, the police really struggled to find anyone to prosecute under the Psychoactive Substances Act. But then they realised you could hear whippets. People would carry some whippets around with them, they'd chink. So they would arrest people for having whippets. And they could accuse anyone with whippets of being a dealer, because there was no limit set as to what a personal amount, or how many whippets would be acceptable as a personal amount for use. So people were prosecuted for having 20 whippets. They were prosecuted as being a drug dealer, which was illegal because that was supplying nitrous oxide. It was also quite easy to see shops selling whippets because, again, they're big, bulky, they're in boxes. So what happened? The market shifted to canisters. Now, one of those canisters is equivalent to 500 whippets. Those canisters look like any other canister. It could be a butane canister. It's almost impossible to know what is being sold in a shop like that, particularly if it comes from under the counter. And so we suddenly had a massive increase in the total amount of nitrous oxide people were using. People were sitting and were using these canisters essentially inhaling it for minute after minute, hour after hour, in a way they could not do with the balloons. And it was that massive increased intake of nitrous oxide which led to the nerve damage, which then has been a source of great concern, particularly by neurologists. So nitrous oxide used in huge amounts does cause nerve damage because it depletes vitamin B12. So we created the monster of the nitrous oxide canister because we were prosecuting people for using whippets. And I've said all along, if we'd set a simple allowance, say of 15 whippets per person, plus a deposit of 10p per whippet, so that there wasn't littering, there wouldn't be any harms from nitrous oxide. But because we wanted to punish people for using the drug, we created the monster of the canister, and now it's being banned. And there's an election coming up, as you probably all know, and because of that, nitrous oxide has become a victim of the pro-prosecution, the pro-prohibition lobby. Suella Braverman wants to criminalise them on the grounds partly of harm and partly because they cause littering. And as I've said, the simple way to deal with littering is to have a deposit. People would clear them up for 10p each. And the littering is way less than you get with things like beer. So here's a cartoon of her and talking to some people who, from next Thursday, will be arrestable just for doing that. And given that there are about 3 million nitrous oxide users in the country, if they were to arrest them all, that would be a very serious challenge to the police. And also creating enormous hostility, in the same way as 1 million young people who were arrested for cannabis use turned against the police. And I've been thinking, particularly in the context of this talk, what are the role models that we actually seem to be using for our, what are our Home Secretaries looking to as role models? Well, of course, the first one is Cruella, which rhymes with Suella, as you probably know. And then, of course, There are witches, and I thought that was quite opposite, given that this is Halloween. And but what I guess most people don't realise is that witches actually were one of the great pioneers of psychopharmacology. What were they brewing up in their cauldrons? Well, we know that witches, in fact, were wise women. They were women that understood the power of mushrooms, the power of ergot fungi, and other natural plants. And they were using a very weak form of a psychedelic, ergotamine, to help women deal with bleeding after childbirth, to help milk let down, deal with headaches, etc. So the very beginnings of psychedelia were probably attributed to women looking for treatments for other women. But of course, in a male-dominated society, they did get rather a short shrift, and a lot of them suffered as a result. But their insights, of course, eventually led to the development of LSD from ergot. But before I get on to psychedelics, I just want to emphasize that the nitrous oxide is but the culmination of 100 years of politicians getting it wrong and wrong and wrong. So historically, why did we ban opium smoking back in 1910? Because we didn't like the Chinese in East London, and because drug companies wanted to stop use of opium. They wanted people to use morphine and heroin. And what happened? Well, we stopped people smoking opium, and they switched to injecting heroin, and definitely not as safe. Alcohol prohibition, 1923, what did that lead to? Massive rise of hooch, people dying of methanol poisoning, and of course the rise of organised crime. Cannabis, banning of cannabis back in 2000s has led to the rise of spice, synthetic cannabinoids. The banning of methadone has massively increased the use of cocaine and deaths from cocaine, and to some extent from amphetamines. The banning of MDMA, or the prosecution of the production of MDMA in terms of precursors, has led to the rise of more toxic compounds like PMA. And the banning of LSD has led to the rise of more powerful toxic compounds like the M-bombs. Now heroin has led to new synthetics, and we've got now fentanyl. So our policies on drugs over the last 100 years have almost completely, systematically produced more harms than good. And that's known, it's just ignored. But there's another side to this. You might say, well, okay, it's people's choice to take drugs, so if you're banning drugs, if they choose to ban drugs and get them to use more dangerous drugs, it's their own fault. Well, yes, you could argue that. But on the other hand, the banning of drugs has had a really destructive effect on the development of medicines. And there are very, very many medical disorders, both psychiatric and neurological, that could be helped by the drugs which have been banned. And I'm not going to go through all these, but you can read them. It's a pharmacopoeia of potential novel medicines in the illegal drug basket. And the regulations make them almost impossible to research. And I'm going to give you examples of that in a minute. But just for completeness, before we finish with nitrous oxide is a medicine. It's not just an analgesic. It also can be used to help people with severe depression, because it distorts the brain in similar ways to psychedelics, which are now becoming established as treatments for depression. So just another example of the contempt that politicians have, not just for the science of harm reduction, but also the value and the interests of doctors. So let's look at a few other drugs. There's the opium poppy there on the left, there's cannabis, there's alcohol, I'll come back to that at the end. And then there are the psychedelics, magic mushrooms. I just love that bottom left-hand image. That is the oldest recorded image of the use of a psychedelic. It's a carving from an Algerian cave, and that's a mushroom man. Well, at least we think he's a mushroom man because he's got a lot of mushrooms. In fact, he's got mushrooms everywhere. And that can't be an accident, I think. So what about cannabis? Well, again, one of the oldest known medicines, one of the plants which almost certainly contributed to the development of the belief systems and the gods of Hinduism. And it seems quite likely that these multi-limbed creatures, gods, were probably seen as a result of some kind of a trip. The current thinking is that soma, the drink that purportedly thwarted the development of the Hindu belief system, was probably a combination of cannabis plus ephedra, which is a stimulant, plus magic mushrooms. And still today we have the sadhus in India who are wise men, religious men who use cannabis on a regular basis. And the big celebration of Holi in India is a celebration where people drink cannabis to reconnect with their ancestors. But cannabis isn't just a way of thinking about oneself or thinking about the past. Cannabis also had quite an impact in the West in ways which have been generally ignored or denied. The Dutch school, Rembrandt's school of painting, he encouraged the use of cannabis amongst his trainees because he thought it gave them better appreciation of colour and depth. And this is just a wonderful image. I find it really a very compelling image of a philosopher who's meditating in his room, trying to think up new ways of presumably turning base metals into gold. But it's quite likely it was created in part because cannabis helped Rembrandt see things differently. And of course, it's generally accepted that the whole origin of jazz came as a result of the use of cannabis. Black musicians would essentially play when they were stoned, and it allowed them to play very differently. It allowed them to break out of conventional notation and syncopate. And that's quite a major cultural advance, I would have thought, the advent of jazz. But of course, cannabis has been vilified for much longer than nitrous oxide. And the origins of the vilification started after the repeal of the alcohol prohibition in the States, when the Harry Anslinger, who was the head of what we would now call the DEA, was faced with unemployment of him and his army, so he created a new fear, which was cannabis, which he renamed as marijuana, to focus hatred against Mexicans, because that's the Spanish word for it. And that perpetuated, but at a relatively low level, to the 1960s, when this man, John Ehrlichman, was challenged to get his man, Richard Nixon, elected. Nixon had already failed. He'd lost the campaign earlier on to Kennedy. He came back, and he was facing a challenge because he was pro-Vietnam War and most Americans weren't. So Ehrlichman came up with a new plan. We've got to deal with our enemies. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. You probably thought about it. And just be careful. We actually now are in a country where being against some wars is probably going to be illegal fairly soon. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalising both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. So he created a new monster, the monster of drugs. They started the war on drugs, and it was a brilliant success. It deflected people's attention from the war in Vietnam to the war on drugs. And that's exactly what is happening in a lesser way. We're getting people concerned about drugs like nitrous oxide. It's deflecting people away from the failures of this current government to some kind of purported trivial successes, which aren't successes at all. But what's worse, as afterwards, it was a very successful campaign. Nixon won, as you know. He won every state except Maine, because he was going to deal with this terror of drugs, which he created. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And, well, I don't know, I guess you're probably all following what's going on in the COVID inquiry. politicians haven't got any better since then, have they? But the victims also knew that they were lying. And as these protesters point out, the war on drugs actually is a war in America very much on black people. And the war on cannabis has done massive harms, not just to the people who use cannabis, but also to the nature of cannabis. Because the attack on cannabis has distorted the whole of the cannabis market. So traditional cannabis used when it's normally grown is a mixture, a plant which makes about 4 to 5% THC, 4 to 6% cannabidiol. These are substances which have very opposite effects. THC can be anxiogenic and produce psychotic-like paranoid effects, impairs memory and learning. Cannabidiol reduces anxiety, helps sleep, it's antipsychotic. So traditional cannabis was a recreational drug that had the right balance of the two elements that people were looking for. But the banning of cannabis has led, that's the traditional cannabis, it's you're happily stoned. But what happened, particularly in this country, was that we waged a war on cannabis, and this was the Blair and Brown government. We waged a war on cannabis for political reasons. Blair and Brown wanted to show they were as tough on drugs as the Tories who were. And we were quite successful in reducing the importation of cannabis. So there was a switch to homegrown hydroponic production under ultraviolet lights changed dramatically the content. So CBD wasn't produced, the levels of THC grew massively, and skunk was produced. And that, we know, creates more psychosis, more dependence, and more harm. So again, trying to get rid of a relatively harmless product, we've created a much, much more harmful product. And who brought this? Well, Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown did this because, I think, largely for moral principles, but also for political ones as well. And of course, it got worse because it led to the rise of synthetic cannabinoids, which I haven't got time to talk about now. And the drug laws are extraordinarily destructive. It's not generally known that the majority of people in this world are denied access to strong painkillers because their countries, India, China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, refuse to allow access because it's easier for them to deny access than to comply with the complicated regulations that the WHO and the UN set on the control of morphine. I'll tell you a story. This was a really chilling interchange I had with a Ukrainian doctor last week. I've been trying to encourage Ukraine, which is not part of Europe and not part of Russia, to make MDMA and psilocybin available as a treatment for the hundreds of thousands of their population that are suffering the traumas of war. And the doctor said, yeah, this is a really good idea, David, but it's not going to be easy. And I said, well, you can do it, you just got to vote in your parliament that they're medicines, and just do it. And she said, yeah. We've been independent for 8 years. It took us 7 years to get morphine legal as a medicine. Because there's an enormous resistance by institutions to change the law. I couldn't believe it. I found that kind of disturbing. I mean, thank goodness they have, because they've got a great need of painkillers now. But the idea that you could, I didn't realize, you'd think every Western country would have access to medicine, but it took them 7 years to change their own Russian laws. Okay, and the reality is we have cannabis. We don't use it much in Britain, but at least we can pay for it if we put the money. Most countries in the world still don't have medical cannabis. There's only one country in the world, Australia, just 2 months ago, that allowed psilocybin psychedelic as a treatment in medicine. MDMA is still banned everywhere in the world. And they're all in UN Schedule 1, which means that research is virtually impossible. And this perhaps is the most unpleasant graph of all. This shows the impact of the UN conventions in 1971, which banned psychedelics. You can see up to 1971 there was a massive increase. These are the number of papers published every year for LSD in blue and psilocybin in pink. This is a revolution in science, particularly in psychiatry. And then the UN conventions, the drugs got banned, and the publications disappeared because governments weren't funding the research, and even if you could get money to do the research, they wouldn't give you the drug. They said it was too dangerous. There was a deliberate ploy to eliminate all knowledge of psychedelics, I believe. Luckily, we've been fighting back, and I'll tell you a little bit about it in a minute. And the same is true of cannabis. There was a rising interest in cannabis as a medicine, and then the conventions were crushed it. And again, now that's been fighting back. But in those periods, the ban on psychedelics has now lasted 50 years. How many lives has it saved from banning them? Probably none. How many lives have been lost because of the therapeutic value of psychedelics? Probably tens of millions of people would be better off if we'd kept psychedelics as therapies. And I think that's the worst censorship of research ever. I can't think of a worse example. The best I can come up with in terms of the magnitude and the destructiveness of censorship of research was in 1616 when the Catholic Church banned the telescope, and they did it for the same reasons. They did it because they didn't like the idea that the establishment could be challenged. They wanted to be in control. They didn't like the fact that Copernicus had worked out that the Earth was not the centre of the universe, the sun was, and they basically told people, if you say that, you'll be killed. And they killed Giordano Bruno. Was a very interesting. He was a priest. He had really remarkably modern ideas about the nature of space, of the universe, etc. So they burnt him at the stake for that. They gave Galileo an option: recant or be burnt as well. He decided to recant. But that ban lasted about 150 years. The ban on psychedelics has lasted 55. And the ban on the telescope only applied to Catholic countries. So the Northern Europeans could carry on looking at the skies. So astronomy didn't end. And also, to be honest, there weren't that many astronomers, so it wasn't a great impact on science. Whereas the ban on psychedelics and cannabis has denied hundreds of thousands of researchers and clinicians access to what could be really useful therapies. So it is way the most destructive censorship in the history of science. And this is a wonderful quote from George Bernard Shaw: "Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." And I hope that research can help change people's minds, because we're clearly not winning the arguments using morality. We're not really using the arguments using common sense. But I'm just wondering whether medical research might be the one way of trying to overturn this hostile leviathan against drugs. And I'm going to say a little bit more about psychedelics, because you can make a really strong case that the use of psychedelics in ancient Greece led to the underpinning intellectual developments which we now use as basically the cornerstones or the platforms of all Western thought. So the Greeks knew that mushrooms were interesting. So there's this is I think one of these is Demeter and the other is Persephone. Yeah, giving each other mushrooms. And here's Demeter partaking of ergot. The Greeks knew that when ergot started to grow on cereals, if you mixed it with wine, you got a really interesting drink. And they used that to fuel what they call the Eleusinian Mysteries. And these were the celebrations of dance and theatre and music and poetry that took place when the ergot grew on the cereals. They didn't know it was a fungus. They thought it was the natural end product of growing cereals, and they really enjoyed it. And as a result of those insights that they got from using this psychedelic mixture, that's quite likely, I think that's quite likely to have led to the broadening of their intellectual attitudes across the board, the development of geometry and logic and also, of course, of different ways of thinking about government, such as democracy. And it's unquestionably the case that Western society is to a large extent modelled on the premises of the Greek culture. So maybe psychedelics have actually underpinned what we do. The problem is we've lost the principles that the Greeks had. And you can make the case that psychedelics in the last century were one of the most important discoveries. There's LSD, discovered in 1943. I think alongside that, perhaps the other most important scientific event in the last century was the atom bomb. And one of them, of course, had the opportunity to change humanity for the better, and the other one to get rid of humanity. And you all, of course, will have heard of Aldous Huxley, and you all, that's a pun, by the way, towards it, but you all know about Brave New World, and you all know about the use of soma to control the population of drones who were doing all the work. He didn't quite get the pharmacology right. What he really should have talked about was alcohol, but that's another story. But eventually he did get it right, because he took mescaline from the peyote cactus, and he wrote about it in The Doors of Perception. And that's a quote from William Blake, the great English painter, mystic, philosopher, who said this: "As the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." And Huxley realised that mescaline had opened his mind. And then he thought, well, hang on, what's closing my mind? And he came to this conclusion: the brain is an instrument for focusing the mind, and that the control of the mind by the brain was liberated by mescaline. And that was a really extraordinarily clever and precipient insight, because modern neuroscience shows exactly that. Now, for a while, LSD was legal. And it was used by 2 Nobel Prize winners. On the right is Kerry Mullis, who took an LSD trip, and he was trying to work out how he could get enough material, this is DNA, get enough DNA, which had been, the structure of which had been discovered by this man, Francis Crick, with Jim Watson, how to get enough of this so he could do some biochemistry on it. And he said during an LSD trip, he saw the double helix unraveling like a series of serpents. And serpentine hallucinations are quite common with psychedelics. And he realised what he had to do was go away and find an enzyme that would do that. So he did. He found the enzyme, polymerase. He developed the PCR, and the PCR underpins all modern biology. It also underpins all modern foods. Everything you eat is PCR. So if you can find out whether it is a beef burger or a veggie burger or even a horse burger if you don't want one. And he said, without LSD, I wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize. Crick was rather different. Crick had already gotten the Nobel Prize before he tried LSD. And then he realised, actually, that discovering the nature of life was a pretty trivial thing. He'd done it. What else was there to do? What was the next challenge? And he realised that the big challenge was to understand his mind. And I think both of them would have agreed with this quote from Einstein: no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And that's what psychedelics give people the opportunity to see things very differently. And I just want to remind you that Steve Jobs, the man who made the most successful company the world has ever seen, certainly in terms of turnover, was very clear that psychedelics helped him understand that the future of engineering was not just function, but also form. Aesthetic value was important. And psychedelics changed an awful lot when they were legal in the 50s and 60s. They changed music and they changed art, you can see from those posters there. Even in Great Britain. This is something, I don't know if any of you kind of realise this, but this is obviously the Sgt. Pepper cover. This is before LSD. and this is after. And art's changed. And all that was okay, but the thing that really began to stick in the establishment's throat was the fact that psychedelics changed people to love each other rather than hate each other. And the threat of society not wanting to go to war was overwhelming. And it was that call to make love, not war, that actually drove the banning of psychedelics in the late 60s and 70s, because it confronted the way in which almost all, certainly all Western states and many other states, viewed their future, which was about more war. And there was a threat of a political revolution, people refusing to fight. And in fact, LSD got banned, I think, because it changed the way young Americans were voting. And it would have presumably altered the whole way in which America did diplomacy if they got their way. So they banned LSD thinking it would stop young people wanting not to fight. In fact, it didn't. Interestingly, of course, the Vietnam War, or the protests on the Vietnam War, which were fueled to some extent by psychedelics, they continued till the war got banned. The war stopped. But they never undid the ban on psychedelics, because undoing drug laws is almost impossible, particularly if they get put into the UN conventions. And it's not generally known that the ban on psychedelics occurred in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in the world at the time, Bobby Kennedy, Secretary of State, would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. And he's saying to his bureaucrats, why, if these projects, and the US government has spent billions on projects with LSD over the last 15 years, why are they worthwhile 6 months ago? Why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep going around and around. If I could get a fat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? He knew he was being lied to, but he couldn't stop it. I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. But he couldn't stop it, because the bureaucracy of banning drugs has almost a sort of subterranean energy, and they're still banned. I just want to say a little bit about our research in terms of how psychedelics do change the mind, and I'm going to use vision as an example, because it is remarkable. It shows just exactly how accurate Huxley was in terms of understanding how the brain controls the mind. What you see in your head, in your brain, your brain is not a camera. You're not taking pictures of what's going on up there. What's happening is that light is going into your eyes, and the different aspects of the light are being encoded in electrical signals, which go up the optic nerve into the large chunk of the back of the brain, which coordinates and makes sense and pulls together all those different electrical impulses to make an estimate of what's out there in the world. And then another part of the brain, the frontal part of your brain, makes a prediction as to what's out there based on what you've seen before, and the two are married up. And if the prediction is the same as what's coming in, you're happy, and if the prediction is different, you think differently. Psychedelics disrupt the ability of this large chunk of brain, the optic part of the brain, to coordinate the pulling together of all those different inputs. And so you can have these hallucinations. And these are what we call primary hallucinations, elemental hallucinations. And we know from 40 years of physiological experiments, some of which gained the Nobel Prize, that is how visual constructs are built up. They're built up from these very simple shapes, colours, and movements. So in fact, under LSD, when you're seeing these hallucinations, you're actually seeing the primary workings of your brain, which you've never been able to see before. And this is the first ever image, we're very proud of this, of LSD. This is brain imaging under LSD, showing massively increased connectivity of the visual cortex. This is the visual cortex here. Normally the visual cortex just talks to itself, a bit to the hippocampus for memory. Under LSD, the visual cortex connects with everywhere in the brain, and that's why people have powerful, really complicated visual hallucinations. But also, well, you get phenomena like synesthesia, because the visual cortex is talking to the auditory cortex. So you can see sounds or hear colours. And that insight of ours led us to thinking that there are really two separate dimensions now of consciousness. There's a dimension which is the traditional way of thinking about consciousness, which is you stimulate a transmitter called glutamate, and that keeps you awake, it allows you to pay attention, it lays down memory. And it lays down memory in a really precise, what I call parcellated way. Every single thing you remember from tonight has been driven by glutamate, the neurotransmitter, acting on a particular receptor on a particular set of neurons. The psychedelics do something very different. They give valence or meaning, and they allow you to integrate things, thoughts, activities, visions, etc. So they're orthogonal, but they intersect, which is useful because it means that when you have these insights, you still remember them. Well, I just want to give you an example of this from art, because I think this perhaps makes sense of it. So this is a very famous picture by Surat. It's a pointillist picture, and you can see every single brushstroke there is put on. And that's glutamate. That's what glutamate does. It just lays down fact in your brain. But it's not that interesting, really, is it? I mean, it's you can see what it is, but it's not as compelling as the final picture. The integrated picture is way more interesting, and that's what serotonin receptors, the targets of psychedelics, do. But also psychedelics tell us more. They also tell us the capacity of the brain can be enhanced. So this is a picture, a very famous picture. This is the San Giorgio Maggiore at dusk by Monet. And this is an email I got many years ago now from someone who said, all my life I've suffered from red dichromacy, that's a kind of colour blindness. After psilocybin, I viewed Monet's San Giorgio, a painting which I'd previously seen as a dull mass of brown and blue. All of the colours I was previously unable to see were there on the screen. And the emotion that I felt made me unable to speak for about half an hour. And we were so intrigued by this phenomenon that someone who's colour blind can actually see colours properly again, which completely contradicted every theory of colour blindness at work. We did a survey for the Global Drug Survey, and we found about 50% of colourblind people who take psychedelics do have significantly improved colour vision. One of the reasons for that may be that the brain becomes more connected under psychedelics. These two images are images of connectivity in the normal brain under placebo and under psilocybin. And you can see there are many, many more connections under psilocybin. That's because for all of us, our brains constrain what we do to make sure that we carry on doing what we've always done efficiently. So mostly your visual cortex, I showed you that in the LSD study. The visual cortex talks to the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, auditory cortex. Of course, if you see a bus bearing down on you, you've got to move your legs to get out of the way. But the brain is so efficient as a computer that because it doesn't waste much time with these long distance energy-inefficient, energy-using connections. Under psychedelics, those connections are made. So you basically put the brain back to where it was as a child, when all things were possible. And in that state of increased connectivity, various important things happen. People get new solutions to old problems. They see themselves differently. They see mistakes they've made. They see things that have happened to them that they've repressed and denied. And that opening up of the mind, those increased connectivity under psychedelics, I think explains why these drugs are so effective in disorders like depression, addiction, etc. They break the old patterns of thinking. But as I said, only in Australia is there access to psychedelics for depression at present. I want to finish with just a few observations about other mushrooms. This is Amanita muscaris, the Caucasian, North European, Siberian mushroom. And here's a Roman mosaic showing how you make mushroom tea, which is just hot water and mushrooms. There's a very compelling argument that Some of the early religions, of which Christianity was one, used to use amanita either for insights or to promote resilience. And the argument why that is the case comes from drawings like this, where the tree of life in the Garden of Eden wasn't actually an apple tree, because we know apples weren't invented then, but it might well have been a mushroom. And the most compelling one here, this is the famous Canto Psalter, and this is the day God created plants. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? These were all mushrooms. And this book by John Allegro is a fascinating insight into how amanita might well have been a powerful promoter of early Christianity, and particularly the resilience they needed to cope with the persecution they had. But more recently, amanita's probably underpinned one of the most famous books of all time. We know that amanita produces changes in perception of size, and I think it's quite likely that what Alice was drinking was probably containing amanita, muscimol, because of the size changes. But we think the caterpillar was probably using cannabis, but we're not entirely sure. We don't know what these mushrooms are doing here. I'll just finish with alcohol, because as you all know, it's a serious challenge, particularly if you start drinking at that age, unless you're a god. But alcohol is a remarkable drug. It's the stuff of miracles. After Lazarus, I guess, the changing of water into wine is probably the most famous miracle of Jesus. Why? Because you couldn't celebrate a Jewish wedding without wine. And of course, alcohol's been part of the religious ceremonies for the last 2,000 years. And monks were given control of it, so they could sup a little as they were collecting it to sell. And it is the ultimate social drug, almost the only social drug you can use, certainly the only legal social drug you can use. But it causes lots of problems. And the WHO estimates 3.5 million premature deaths a year from alcohol, second only to tobacco. And also a lot of problems. Even at Ascot, it doesn't matter what clothes you wear, alcohol will still encourage violence. So, in my whole professional life as a doctor, I've seen so much harm from alcohol that I spend a lot of my time trying to research ways of reducing the harm. And alcohol is such a complicated drug, it affects so many different parts of the brain and body that it's impossible to find an antidote to alcohol. And about 15 years ago, when I was in favour with the government, and I was the lead author on this Department of Trade and Science book, Drugs, Brain Science, Addiction and Societies of Drugs in the Future, we came up with the idea that if we couldn't find ways of stopping alcohol harming you, or us, maybe we could replace it. And I've written about this for some time. There's a front page of New Scientist. It talks about that principle, and it is completely within the realm of modern medicine, modern science, modern pharmacology to do that. And it's always comforting to know that your ideas have become sort of mainstream when you get a cartoon in the Times about them. And I was really touched by this. Yes, you can read it yourself. Some of you are too young to know who these people were, but the parents in the audience will know that. So we've started making one. It's a rather naff picture of me, but I didn't want to wear the white coat. But we've invented a botanical drink which contains herbs, food-grade herbs, which actually do work on the GABA system, and it actually is what most people find quite a viable alternative to alcohol. And a bit of a plug for our community. Those of you who join the drug science community, you will be able to get this at a discounted rate. And if you want to check out the science, there's a big paper we published last year on the science behind this principle. It's a free download. And I'll finish before I take questions. Just go back to the Alice in Wonderland and these wonderful cartoons. Who can remember what the Dormouse said? Well, I'm sure you all do. Feed your head. So if you want to feed your head more on what I've talked to you about, there's a few books I've written. There's books on me, there's books on drugs, There's books on British drug policy, there's books on the brain, there's books on other drugs. And there's now the psychedelic book, which has just come out, so feel free to buy that. And next time I see you, I will sign a copy. And also feel free to support drug science. And if you want to support our work, and I'll leave that up, you can take a photo of that, and perhaps you will support us. Thank you all very much. Okay, we've got till 8, so we've got 20 odd minutes for questions. All right. Oh, you've got to do yours. Yes. That's fine. All right, who's got some questions then? Let's not waste time. Yeah, do you want to put the lights on?
Yeah, I was going to
Well,
say,
you ask the question, yeah.
How quickly until your drink gets outlawed?
Yes, quite. Well, this one can be outlawed, the one we've got, because it is made of food-grade herbs, so you have to ban foods. Hang on, don't give them ideas. But the synthetic variant, which I didn't have time to talk about, yes, so we're also making a synthetic variant which will replace alcohol. We're not even going to bother to develop it in Britain, because how can you persuade investors to give you what would be quite a lot of money to take you through food safety when there is no route and you've got no guarantee that the sun won't turn against you? I mean, the sun hate me, the mail hate me, the express hate me, you know. I mean, so what do you do in the States where at least they do have they actually do tell you what to do, and if you meet their criteria for safety, it will be launched in America. Yes?
How do you think we best bridge the gap between the scientific literature and the opinions of politicians?
Yeah, well, one of the problems is we don't have any scientists, almost. No. I don't think there's a PhD in Parliament now. This is kind of worrying, isn't it, really? Explains a lot, too. Yeah, it's... I don't think we can change politicians. I think we have to change the media. I think and maybe this COVID thing will finally break the mold. The idea that you can do what you like because you like to do it. You can run roughshod over what your scientific advisors are telling you. I mean, it's going to come out as being so destructive. It's quite conceivable that some of the politicians who deliberately flouted the scientific guidance on COVID, you know, maybe they'll get prosecuted, maybe they'll go to prison for cynically disregarding evidence. That might change things, because we can't keep going on the way we're going on. I mean, so I suppose the simple answer is you've got to vote in better politicians. It's not entirely clear who they are, but I think the Lib Dems at least have a rational, honest policy on drugs. And if they were to get back into coalition with Labour and insist that drug policy was one of their key elements, then I think there might be scope for change. But scientists have got to stand up, and we've got to challenge the sort of prejudices and the stupidity that you see all around us all the time. Yeah.
So it's my understanding that you can now take cannabis. The NICE guidelines advise for certain things.
Yes.
But there's an issue with GPs prescribing it.
Shall I talk you through that, shall I?
Yeah, and what would change that?
Okay, so the position is this. Cannabis is now a medicine, an approved medicine in the UK as of 2018, but it's only prescribable by specialists. And since specialists are usually old white men who've made their careers researching things other than cannabis, most of them don't even know how to spell cannabis, and they don't know how to use it, and they don't want to use it because they don't want to be told by their patients what to do. So it was a kind of both a clever and a dumb thing for the Chief Medical Officer Sally Davis to do. I don't know I think it was probably accidental. I don't think she expected such hostility from the medical profession about using it. So the reality is it's been a medicine for 5 years. There have been 5 prescriptions on the NHS. And that is because even when doctors want to prescribe it, it's blocked by pharmacists. Because doctors, you may not realise this, but doctors aren't allowed to prescribe what they want anymore. Most doctors can't prescribe unless a pharmacist who controls the budget allows them to. And the pharmacists don't want it because I guess they don't understand it, and it's sort of a controlled drug, and they haven't been educated. So it's a sort of perfect storm of ignorance and almost malice And I think that there's a particular area of medicine, with cannabis medicine, which is childhood epilepsy, where I think the failure to prescribe cannabis to children with epilepsy is probably leading to about 40 deaths a year. And I think it's the worst paediatric health scandal since the Bristol heart scandal. Because the doctors are actively refusing to prescribe a medicine that parents have found works, and then the parents have to pay for it privately. They run out of money. Some of them have sold their houses to keep their kids alive. And the paediatricians are saying there's no evidence it works. And what they're actually saying is that a drug company hasn't done a study to show it works. And we won't believe any evidence other than what a drug company produces. We won't even believe the evidence that we see in front of us, that the children who failed on 7 other anti-epileptic drugs have got better on medical cannabis. We won't believe that. We'll say it could have been a placebo, which of course is absurd. So there's a sort of, again, a malignant hostility in the medical profession. How to change it? Well, the way to change it is we've got to just keep on campaigning, because it's not just morally right, it's not just medically right, but it's also economically right. So we've got examples of people whose children have been in hospital 50% of their life, and now they're not having any seizures at all. So they're saving the health service hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. But that budget isn't, unfortunately, they're saving money from the A&E budget, but that's not going, they can't transfer that to the cannabis pharmacy budget. So it's a problem of the way in which the NHS is siloed. Again, maybe a change in politics, because currently every health secretary has said yes, we'll do something, and has refused because they don't want to confront the doctors who are blocking it. Yeah.
The way you've sort of created alcohol using legal substances, basically, is there a sort of an analogous way to approach psychedelics, doing that? So try and create a compound that mimics the effects of psilocybin, but make it so that it's not sort of legally recognised, or it can sort of fly under the radar or something?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Probably yes. There are quite a lot of herbs out there. In fact, most herbs taken to excess will make you feel strange. But the challenge would be, it might be a lot harder they'd have to be foodstuffs, and I'm not sure there aren't so many really psychoactive foodstuffs.
You had that list of all the kind of synthetic versions of cannabis, LSD, with the M-bombs and the spice market and stuff. But if there was more of a concerted scientific effort, is it, like you said, you're saying it is possible to create viable, sort of safe substances?
You probably could, yeah. It's an interesting thought. I haven't thought much about it, but you could go back to the old the Greeks, maybe just stew up your ergot.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know enough about the nature of the UN bans on lysergic acid derivatives. There's probably some out there in plants that haven't been controlled under the conventions, which the danger is, of course, they would be sucked in. But I think we actually had a major success 2 years ago, by the way. A lot of people don't know this, but people have been inventing derivatives of psychedelics, particularly derivatives of psilocybin, basically so that they can patent them, which is not necessary, because if psilocybin was legal, we wouldn't need other compounds. But the way is, at present, if you want to have control, you have to get a patent. So there were a couple of interesting tryptamines that were being made, and the DEA wanted to ban them straight away. And in fact, I wrote a detailed critique of that plan, arguing that it was unscientific. In the US, they cannot ban something really without having evidence that it has the effect that they think, and they've never been into humans, so we argue you couldn't ban it without putting it into humans, and also the therapeutic use should be a factor, or the potential therapeutic should be a factor. And so the DEA actually gave it up. The DEA didn't ban those 2 tryptamines, and so they're kind of legal, but they're not available. I don't know, because the company that are making them obviously is going to sell them on the streets because they want them to be therapies. But I think we're beginning to slowly win the argument. But again, it's the emphasis on the therapeutic use rather than the recreational that I think is eventually swinging their pendulum. Anyone? Yeah.
So you've explained why governments might want to control drugs, but why aren't more global organizations such as the WHO, collating the evidence as you have and basically saying, it's unscientific to go against drugs? Why aren't they pushing for more support for them? Organizations that are not governments, that don't have a bias necessarily towards wanting drugs outlawed.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting perception you have. So, I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable supposition that the WHO would actually be logical. I mean, I understand where you came from. I kind of thought that until I went there. I went there in 2018 to try, we sent a drug science delegate. Well, I got a bit of time, I'll tell you the story. It's about medical cannabis. And WHO had refused to accept that medical cannabis was medicine. So, drug science, and the way the WHO works, it can only review a drug if either a country or some of its scientific experts ask for it to be reviewed. And we were told that they didn't have the resources to review medical cannabis. They were reviewing all sorts of weird cathinones, but and of course we knew that the US, which funds the WHO, didn't want it reviewed. So we wrote a review. We wrote a review for the WHO to their standards, showing that medical cannabis was medicine. And we went there in 2018 and we presented it to their annual meeting of their scientists. And we said, here, there's your report, now make a decision. They went hysterical. They said, you can't do that. We said, we can. We know under the Constitution we're allowed to submit to this meeting. It's an open meeting. And they actually blocked it. They blocked the report being read. But in the end, they were forced then to do it, and it's now in medicine. But what we discovered in the process of doing that report was that they had never reviewed cannabis as medicine. Cannabis was banned as a medicine by the UN before the UN existed. By the League of Nations. The League of Nations in 1934 said cannabis had no medical value. We didn't. Britain was one of the few countries that said, of course it's got medical value. We held out to 1971 when eventually we conceded because of US pressure. But most of the world said cannabis wasn't a medicine. And they hadn't reviewed it in 84 years. And again, saying they couldn't afford it. But all that meant was that the US wouldn't allow them. So now the WHO it's not autonomous. It's enormously pressured. And to some extent now it's pressured the UN. The WHO is still mostly run by the states, but the UN now is under quite a lot of Russian and Chinese pressure. So they don't want to change. So just to finish the medical cannabis story, so the WHO said, yes, it's a medicine. The UNODC has not approved it. So it's been stuck in the UN now for the last 3 years because Russia and China don't want it to be a medicine, because if it's a medicine, that means that their policies have been wrong saying it wasn't a medicine, and they don't, they like executing people. Countries that like to execute people don't want drugs to be anything other than poisons. Got to stop now, have I?
I think we're done. Yeah.
That's, yeah, okay. Thank you.
I won't keep you for long, but a massive thank you for Dave for coming up and speaking. It was a fantastic talk, if I do say so. Just to say, we'll be here for a couple more minutes if you want to come round. We've got some pamphlets and leaflets down here. There's also some information and links to the Society, as well as to Drug Science up there. Thank you very much for attending. Take care.